Hey y'all, we wanted to help you guys get prepared for Sunday. We had a couple of core group leaders come up and ask, what are we going to be going over, and they pointed out that there's going to be a little bit more work. We wanted to help all of you out with that by sending out this video. We also have a study guide to help you walk through whatever you're doing Sunday with your core group. Hopefully, it's a Bible study. What Josh had slated for Sunday is Exodus 12, which is the Passover. And so we have study guides that we're going to be emailing out to you. If you need a printed version, just shoot us an email and we can have those ready for you in your classrooms for Sunday. So like I said, this week what we're studying through, actually I have them written up here on the board, so I'm just going to write it here. It's going to be Exodus 12, all of it. It's the Passover. And I'm just going to walk through this study guide with you just a little bit. Actually, not really. But when we look at what we've studied so far, we spent all summer talking through Genesis, and that really sets up really the rest of the Bible. Everything that comes after really starts to point back to this idea of creation and the fall. And then, right after the fall, we have the promise of the Messiah. Genesis chapter 3. Which then sets us up to look at the rest of the Old Testament, the prophets, and then and eventually the New Testament, when we're looking at who Jesus is. All that to say, this right here is what we've gone through so far: creation, fall, the flood, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And when Joseph, if we remember, when Joseph brings his family down to Egypt, Exodus opens up that the next leader, he didn't know who Joseph was. And so all the Israelites who were down there, the 12, what we now know as the 12 nations, 12 tribes of Israel, were forced into slavery. And that's kind of the context for Exodus, that the Israelites are in bondage and have been for 400 years. That's this time period right now. And just for any of you A-type, this timeline is not to scale. It's just meant to give us some room to work with. But this time from Egypt to Exodus is 400 years. We talked about last week. We were talking about Moses, a really important guy, Moses, in the burning bush. And that's somewhere along in here. And then also Moses is in there, and he comes in the 10 plagues right in here as well. And then we come to this, which is a big part of what we're talking about today, the Passover. And for us, something that we need to know, the Passover, we talked about the Passover meal, but the Passover is a real event. It's when it was the last of the plagues. It's tied in with it. When death was to come in and take the firstborn of everyone in Egypt, unless they had their doorposts marked with the blood of a lamb, marked on their doorposts. And the angel of death would come and take out the firstborn, unless the blood was there, in which case it would pass over. And the Israelites celebrated this day. Why? Because it was the day that their firstborn were saved? Absolutely. Their lives were spared, but it's also the day that the Exodus started. That very night when Pharaoh woke up, he let my people go. And he finally said, okay. He finds his firstborn killed, and he finally says, go out of my land, that you may worship your God as you have asked. And so it sets them forth here. We eventually get to the 10 Commandments. That happens shortly after the Passover, probably sometime right in there. And they're wandering through the desert until they come to Kadesh. I think it's Kadesh Barnea is the name of the place where they send out the 12 spies. Right? 10 have a good report, 2 have 10 have a bad report, 2 have a good report, Caleb and Joshua, and it sends them into this time of wandering. That's the book of Deuteronomy. After they've sent out the spies and they're forced to wander. And we say 40 years, but what we understand is that from this time, from the time of the Passover to Kadesh, that's 2 years, and then the wandering was 38 years. It really brings the total to 40 years. And then eventually they wander for 38 years into the Promised Land. They cross the Jordan. They defeat Jericho. They spend the rest of the time conquering their land. That's the book of Joshua, and it ends right before the time of Judges. So, what we're looking at is here, the Passover, and what's going on with that? How does that bring life to our story? Well, here's the thing. It's something that I really believe, that it doesn't bring life unless it points us back to Jesus. And so we get this idea. A lot of people use this, that if that the doors, represent the cross and the blood represents Christ's blood. And there's no doubt that that's true. It's about the blood of Christ. But this isn't meant to stand alone. The Passover, it's not. So the Passover doesn't happen that the angel of death passes over. And that's the end of the story. And that's really why I wanted to draw out this timeline, because what we see is that this event right here, this event, the Passover, really launches the Israelites into life, into their history. What we now look back on and say history, it pushes them forward. It pushes them forward to hope. Hope of what? Hope of the promised Messiah, of the hope of, let's bring it back here, the reality of creation, that we would be in the presence of God once again. And what you're going to see is that, and their lives change immediately. The passage today, it's not about a single event that just let them go walking out of Egypt. The Passover is about God's mercy and His grace to them, to push them, to launch them into a life of hope, that they would see Him. Despite everything else that's going on around, I feel like some of the answers can be at times a little dry. This is a story that we know well, and if you have a bunch of kids that grew up in the church, we know this story well. And Pharaoh, ooh baby, let my people go. Yeah. Anyways, and we know that He let them go. But this is also Him pushing them forward into life. I think that's the big point. Sometimes, this was life. This was excitement. This is breaking from bondage and chasing after the hope and the promise of a land that God would give them to be their own, and that they would be the people of God. This week, the students are also reading through Psalm 95 for Wednesday night. And so this idea should be fresh on many of our students' minds as they come in for Wednesday, because that whole psalm points back to this event, to the Exodus, to the Passover. And so my hope for you is that this helped to just give established context. I'm not telling you what to teach or what to make your kids say, but just to give you a little bit of background. Hopefully this time helped, and we'll see you Sunday. All right, take care.